As mentioned, I'm with Route 50, state and local government publication. We've been around for a few years now. We do events like this all around the country, talking about best practices in innovation in government, and of course, we deliver information to you all every day, every weekday, on what's going on in policy and best practices around the country for state and local government. We're really excited, I'm actually extremely excited for this panel. Doing things on data can be tricky because it's such a broad topic. Frankly, I think we have a really good cross-section here, I was just saying earlier, of different approaches to using data for different use cases, and I'm really eager and excited to get in it. In full disclosure, I think this is kind of important to mention as a journalist. I will actually be leaving Route 50 in the very near future, and I am actually joining New York City government, not on the data side per se, but it's important to know as I am sitting on stage with a whole bunch of folks who will be working for my future employer as well. So good to know from your end. I want to be transparent. So let's just start off with how you all, I assume you didn't grow up saying I want to be in data analytics. How did you all come into this role? And if you have any advice for folks who are either starting in data analytics or entering the stream, what they should be thinking about.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm Rodney. Thanks to Route 50 for inviting me to this panel and to the other panelists. Hope we have a good conversation. So I actually went to school for city planning, and I landed at the Department of City Planning at first. And I ended up working for the chief demographer for the city, Joe Salvo, who's still one of my government heroes. And the work there was really interesting because we were analyzing census data for City Hall, for a number of agencies. This was under the previous mayor. And you know, one of the things, the projects that really sort of changed my view on data was through the census, there's a certain threshold that you hit in terms of population where all of a sudden the Voting Rights Act says you have to provide language assistance in polling places for a certain population. And the threshold that was hit in 2010 was a language requirement for Asian Indian. There are dozens of Asian Indian languages, and so we had this task to really figure out what that meant from an operations perspective. Like, how do we figure out what is the actual language community of need? So we dug into the data, and that was census, detailed census and American Community Survey data, but also data from the Board of Elections on surnames, so we can figure out where those people lived and where they voted. And we turned that into, you know, a real action, and I just really, that stuck with me. And, you know, I had an opportunity to go to the Taxi and Limousine Commission, which is where I am today. And something that drew me there was the millions of records that were being collected on yellow taxi trips in New York. And I had read about analysis that the Department of Transportation had done on that data to calculate speeds before and after road improvements or road diets, like the Times Square pedestrianization. So that's what drew me there, and this was 2012. Little did I know there was this whole world that was coming for that agency with the rise of Uber and Lyft. And you know, at the time, we weren't collecting any of that same information from those companies. I remember very well that the best information we had on what Uber was doing in terms of trips was a number written on a manila envelope. And we couldn't figure out if that were a daily number of trips, weekly number of trips, or monthly number of trips. But we went on to, you know, put those same data requirements in for those companies, make a lot of policy based off of that data. And what I get to do today is a lot of that, like taking data to learn about a thing, create a policy, and evaluate that policy, which I just think is a really amazing thing to be doing in government.
And real quickly, advice for people, maybe like a short,
yeah, my quick advice, just learn R, learn Python, and you know, just try to get yourself into a city agency job. I would say don't get overeducated because, you know, frankly, the city titles just aren't ready in terms of like salary or thinking about, you know, experience for new people who are working in data. Honestly, we tend to hire a lot of people out of school who have a strong interest in data analysis, and they really come to the job to learn.
So Lee, I know you came from data from another city altogether, and you're new to New York City relatively.
Yeah.
Talk about how you entered I know you were in Cincinnati, but how did you enter this field? And you were kind of head honcho there for data in Cincinnati.
Yeah, by accident is the answer to that question. So I really didn't set out to do anything in data. My undergraduate degree was in theology. And then
Data's a religion, I mean.
Right, exactly. So then I kind of thought, what am I going to do for graduate school? I ended up going to law school. So I actually am barred in the state of New York, and I thought, I wanted to do law as a way to get to policy. And I sort of accidentally stumbled into data analytics and performance management in Cincinnati. And as soon as I did that, I realized a couple of things. First, I realized that data is not a black box, right? It felt for me, I thought, I'm over here and like liberal arts and STEM is over here and like that's not my lane. And I realized no, this is really, a lot of this isn't even, there are things that are rocket science. A lot of the stuff we're doing is not it. This is a lot of conditions and categories, and this is in this bucket and this is in this bucket. So once I realized that, I realized that data can do more than I kind of previously realized. So when I was in Cincinnati, I became the city's chief performance officer within the first year of being there, and I started really building out the analytics infrastructure. Essentially, what I wanted was not just to be able to see where things are happening or which neighborhoods have the highest percentage of, for example, like heroin overdose responses. I wanted to be able to see that every single day. I didn't want to have to ask for something to get updated. I didn't want anyone to have to manually do something that felt like a waste of time for me. So that's sort of how I got into this and why I had an interest in enterprise data management, data analytics infrastructure, and data analytics as sort of a system rather than just an output or an outcome.
And as far as quick advice for folks entering the field, would it be the whole don't assume that you're one or the other STEM or policy, or?
Yeah, I mean, so I actually hate to go against what you said, but my advice would not be to learn R or Python. My advice would be find something that you want to do and then figure out what you need to do to be able to accomplish it. I really did a lot of learning on the job, and whenever people ask me about how I did that or how I got there, it's not because I knew how to code before I got into the job. It's not, I learned, but I learned because there was something I wanted to accomplish. I learned Python because I needed my addresses to have latitude and longitude. I needed geocoding. I needed to see addresses and street segments in the same data set. I wanted them on the same map. I wanted to be able to do analysis that way, so.
And I know this might be an early question to ask, but how has your experience, the difference in scale, Cincinnati, I think, 600,000, maybe a little larger?
City property. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
To 8.6 million?
Sure.
How is that scaled? I know, a lot of the lessons, do they port over?
Yeah, so I'm actually, something I say often in my current jobs, I am really glad that I did this for a whole city before I came to Parks in particular, because Parks is sort of a city unto itself. It has a lot of functions that in other places are sort of city functions, but I think that my experience is translated well in that when I was in a smaller city, I had significantly fewer resources. So we had to create an infrastructure because I had one data person. I had a bunch of analysts and one DBA. So if we didn't make things update by themselves, if we couldn't set them and forget them, they wouldn't happen. And I think that having that background has really helped me kind of think about how to move forward now with a really fantastic team that is huge, that's relative to me, relative to what I had, it's huge. And thinking of moving forward in the work that we're doing, I understand a lot of the component parts that need to be put together in that sense.
Antaya, I know you look at the broad spectrum of data here in New York City. How'd you end up in your current role, and what have you learned that might impart to folks who are working on this?
Sure. So my story, I'll have to just say, bear with me. It'll get to the point. I'll land at the proper point. I actually didn't start in data like my colleagues here at all. I started as an education policy analyst, and happened to be working for a very small nonprofit that had a rather big influence in kind of this particular domain within the city that I was working at the time. And it was just 3 staff. And so it's like sort of my first job out of college, and my thought at the time was, I'm gonna be a nonprofit, I think policy is the area I wanna be in, And all nonprofits are very small, so I need to learn how to do everything. And so I said, I felt like I had policies, so I earmarked technology, I earmarked finance, earmarked even sort of how to maintain an operation and organizational management as kind of my targets. So the very next job that I happened to sort of network my way to was a database manager. And had no technical skill. My pitch to the the guy who was hiring me was that basically I'm smart and I'm really cheap. So you can't go wrong here. So actually learn on the job how to basically build databases and reflect back, and they were not normalized. They did not have, I didn't know anything about foreign keys or primary keys or anything at the time, but I got them to work. And I think it sparked something in me. From there, I said, I want to make sense of this. I like what I'm doing right here. So I went and got my Master of Public Administration, focusing on information technology, landed in New York City right after I got my degree, having to work for a consulting firm at the time, public sector and technology, IT, public sector consulting. It's really big. A lot of big firms were hiring. I ended up at New York City Human Resources Administration as a business analyst consultant, and my first job was happened to be data warehousing over there. And so that, I think, just kind of led me into the area I am in health and human services in particular. But I think the most fascinating thing for me, having the opportunity to watch millions and millions and millions of records, one of my jobs at HRA was to help train what were largely operational staff in this analytic tool. And so it's both a technical training, but it's a culture and mind shift training. And toward the end of my tenure there, one of the things I oft repeated was, you have basically a data warehouse that has, I won't say an infinite number of answers sitting in the middle of it, but we have yet to kind of scratch the surface of hit the wall of the questions we could answer.
That leads to a question I was going to pitch to you next here, which is, particularly in your position in a city like this, we can probably all agree there's way too much data. If you just look at the amount of data being collected, and there's going to be more every day because we're starting to look at Internet of Things and automated data collection, and that's not a bad thing, certainly, but how do you all make decisions about where to be most effective? Because you could spin your wheels all day collecting data, analyzing data, crunching data. How do you make the prioritization decisions there?
Well, I think priorities come from a number of places. They can come from top down, they can come from bottom up, and sometimes in between. So there are obvious things, particularly I work in the Mayor's Office for Economic Opportunity, which is in the Mayor's Office of Operations. And so there are obviously sort of top-down agenda items that become questions that then become use cases for us to begin pinpointing data. But the one thing I'd like to say,
Is there an example of that?
Sure. So, for example, the mayor 4 years ago announced a career pathways initiative to overhaul, basically, and kind of take another look at the workforce development footprint in the city. Many city agencies run a number of workforce development programs. There are well over 100 serving thousands of New Yorkers every year to help them through job readiness, literacy, education opportunities, training opportunities, and whatnot. And so there was a report actually that's online, and it listed 10 recommendations. Recommendation 10A was like, and we should manage this through an integrated data system in some way. And so, in this kind of big initiative becomes a very kind of targeted question and a list of questions. We at Mayor's Office for Economic Opportunity developed 13 standardized performance metrics. We call them the common metrics. And from my standpoint, leading the data practice, I approach each one of those performance metrics as a business question. So how many clients do we serve in the city? And when I begin engaging agencies, we began kind of saying, all right, if we want to answer that question, and we want to answer it around workforce programs, what are the systems that are you using to manage that? How is data collected? Is it done by direct staff or providers or whatnot? And so there's a number of ways that happened. The one last thing I will say, though, is one of the things I always say is use cases kind of open the door, particularly in the arena that I'm in, where issues of privacy, technology constraints all become a factor. But for someone in your arena, I think a use case should open the door, but it shouldn't necessarily kind of define or hard code the path. A lot of my work becomes legal agreements, and from a data point of view, you've got to be very specific about what you're putting in that legal agreement, and it doesn't help if you have kind of narrowed in on a very, very specific and haven't considered the use cases that you could enable past this point, in which case you may be locked into something for years and years to go.
And I do want to get back to more about working across agencies, but I want to first come to you all and talk to you a bit about choosing the right data sets and the right places to focus on. And do you feel, I think you both have different experiences as far as data. Do you feel there's too much data in the wrong formats, certain data that you look at and say, maybe we shouldn't be holding on to this data? So start with Lee, and then we can kind of go from there.
So I actually don't think there's too much data. I think I'm going to sort of answer this tactically because I think we can talk about priorities and how those get set and what we focus on, and that's very, to your point, top down. But I think tactically, when thinking about how we decide what data we're using and what we look at, there's sort of two things that I think about. The first is data collection. I think that we often collect data that we either sort of already have a proxy for, or we go about collecting it in a way that maybe isn't the most effective. Something that I have sort of realized through my work with the city and as well as with parks is that the best data that you'll collect is data that is created because of something someone's already doing. So for example, when I worked in Cincinnati, I worked a lot with the CAD data, which is computer-aided dispatch. That data exists because somebody called 911, has an emergency. They had to, the dispatcher, the call taker had to write down the emergency and then dispatch someone to get there. If the data isn't accurate, it means a copper firefighter didn't get where they needed to go. If the data isn't accurate, it means that a copper firefighter wasn't prepared with what they needed on the scene. So you have sort of two things. The first is nobody has to do extra work to create that data, right? And the second is the quality of the data is directly related to the quality of the service. So I think that there's a lot of data that's collected in city government that could be sort of framed that way, that could be baked into workflow processes, that could be collected almost passively as part of what people are doing anyway. So I think that's the first place to look as far as, are we doing that? Are there opportunities to do that? And are we thinking about it that way? I think the second part of this, sort of to your point, is that I think the really intimidating part of working with data is thinking, I have this huge amount of data. How do I know what people want to know, right? How do I know what insights people want to derive from this? What if I set this up for one insight, but there's another one, and I haven't sort of set this up? And I think that that's sort of not the right way of thinking about it. There's often, across fields, across data types, across disciplines, people are asking a lot of the same questions of data. They want to know how long something took. They want to know how many. They want to know what percentage. They want to compare it between this neighborhood and that neighborhood. They want to see what's happening where they live. They want to see if that is good or bad. There's a lot of common things that people want to know from data. And I think that when you think about it that way, particularly as a user, if you kind of step back and think, what do I want to know about this data, or what do I want to know about this information, it becomes less intimidating. And I think what I've seen, at least in my work, is that people get stuck on like, well, I don't want to limit the data, or I don't want to do anything to it because that will sort of create some interpretation. We can't go back and look at it from a different angle. I think that that's not necessarily true. I think that especially if you're building an infrastructure, you're doing data warehousing, it's actually very easy to set up your data to answer a number of questions at the same time and to also think realistically about what those questions will be.
And you have a different view of data. Where you come from, you're getting them primarily from private sources. Is that the case?
Yeah, so as a regulator of for-hire transportation in New York, we're not sort of top-down controlling taxis or Uber or Lyft, but we're sort of providing the carrot-stick framework for how service should work, and we always focus on our key priorities are safety, accessibility, consumer protection, and driver welfare. So we sort of like to think of things through those lenses. If it doesn't fit one or more of those, then it's typically not a priority for us to look into. I think one of the really interesting things about the team that I lead is it's both policy analytics, but it's also external affairs. And a lot of that is from, when I started, we were a team of 10 that was doing policy and external affairs together. And the team has just sort of grown. But what we get, the benefit of having those two teams sit side by side is that, that the external affairs team is hearing from, the driver constituency. So we license over 200,000 drivers for hire in New York. So we hear a lot of things from them. So it's really a pipeline for us to start thinking about the things that we should look into with the data that we have. I think one prime example of that is as we were focusing on sort of a safety-based policy of limiting driver hours behind the wheel so that drivers aren't driving while drowsy, which can be just as dangerous as driving while drunk. We were hearing from a lot of drivers about how they need to work more hours because they simply aren't making enough money, especially as companies like Uber and Lyft continue to reduce their fares over the years, and they weren't getting more of them like they promised, more trips. So we looked to the data, and we got a lot more data that we didn't have regularly reported to us. We sort of had this ability to direct any of our licensees, so Uber and Lyft being licensees of ours, we directed them to send us a couple weeks of full, fair financial data, and we did a really deep dive, and that was before we put in place a new data reporting requirement. So we sort of had a trial run of what data the companies are actually collecting in the form they collect it naturally, so back to your point. So as we develop this driver pay minimum, which is just a minimum amount per trip that drivers have to earn, so they make something close to 15 an hour, because they are considered independent contractors by these companies, so they don't have that same guarantee that a lot of others have. So as we develop that policy, side by side, we also developed the data spec, how we would enforce that policy. And it was from both that data we had collected before and its sort of native form from the companies. But also, I think, over the years we've learned to really take a page out of, sort of private tech and not be afraid to iterate a little bit. So developing that spec, sharing it with the companies, getting their feedback on, no, we don't collect this data point, or we can in the future, or this data point isn't really what you think it means. So being able to sort of release the original spec, we're going to release a new one that's sort of based on our learnings of what the data is actually telling us and whether it's useful or not. And I think also, on that, back to something that Deputy Mayor had mentioned, working with our agency partners who we know also use that data to make sure that data works for them too.
Yeah, and so I want to shift the conversation a bit. I want to talk a little bit about the ecosystem that you work with this data in, because none of this can happen without the right technology, the right workforce, the right data coming in to that, and frankly, trying to get to that point, modern systems that can handle this data, modern forms that allow for data aggregation in a simple manner, and you're not pulling it off of PDFs, as the Deputy Mayor pointed out. That's key, and that also underpinning all that is the F-word funding. So I'm going to put Tayeb on the spot first here and talk a little bit about how do you make the case to build the right ecosystem for if you're an agency or if you're, because there's always money in data, right, in efficiency and things like that, but getting people to recognize that to do it right costs money also. How do you do that? How do you articulate that? How do you get kind of the visionary backing of the leadership on that?
So my team in the Mayor's Office for Economic Opportunity, I lead a team that actually has three components to it. So there's our technology and integration services team, there's our analytics team, and then we have what we call our data governance and policy team. And actually within that group, before we start typically on the technology or the analytics side, our first point of the first place we start at is engagement. And I've used the word use case. We are constantly, I think, in a process of working with different agencies across the health and human services domain to understand and build compelling use cases. And by that we mean these could be answering big policy problems or sometimes very localized problems to the agency. Documenting this in a way that kind of reads across different audiences, both programmatic, operational, as well as legal audience and leadership as well. And then from there, I think it's a process of really kind of iterative engagement. We've learned, I think, through sort of our lessons learned, is that it really, I mentioned top-down, but it really helps when there isn't sort of like a necessarily top-down agenda that you're working from, that you really kind of build up bottom-up support, i.e. that for whom this data is intended, for whom this system is intended, they understand where their capabilities could be extended. They understand that use case. They're supporting, they become a sponsor of that use case with you. So it's not just you hanging out in the field. And together, I think the more of a coalition you can build, the better of a case you can, especially in a practical sense when you get to, if something requires some level of funding that you have to go to OMB. OMB will rightfully, I think, direct and say, well, does this already exist? You know, or is somebody already doing that? And in this case, it behooves you to have done sort of your bottom-up research to make sure that you can answer that question, anticipate it, answer it, and really kind of make the case for where the value is going to lie in this.
Lee, do you have, whether it's from Cincinnati or here?
Sure.
Yeah.
So I think my approach to this has always been to sort of brute force duct tape things together initially, and then kind of prove that there's really a need. So for that product or for that instance. So in Cincinnati, we initially built our data analytics infrastructure with really like not much. I mean, we had very little overhead. It was sort of duct taped together, but the point was to create something that sort of would help people understand that this is what they want. So when we had departments or when we had executive level people suddenly seeing their data in visualizations, they started seeing data refreshing every day. They started seeing data on the internet in a way that they could sort of consume it. It worked on their phones. All of a sudden, they understood that this is something that they wanted to invest in. I haven't had a lot of success convincing people to invest in something that they can't see or don't understand, which I think is sort of pretty normal, particularly in 2019, right? People want to sort of see something before they're like, yes, absolutely, let me sort of invest in this. So I think my approach has been, you know, let's show what we can do. And then when the demand inevitably comes, which in my experience it always does, if you build something that's, you know, worth having or worth using, that's your opportunity to say, hey, I have like one analyst, or I have this is my infrastructure or my tool that I'm using. We can do this at an enterprise level. This is what it's going to look like. And I think having something, sort of a proof of concept there already really helps make that case.
I totally agree on that point. Something that I have a lot with my team, what I like to call secret projects, and it's that sort of starting to build those demos of what we think we can do. Actually, one time I had written on my whiteboard in my office, like secret projects, and there was, I should have labeled it better, a number of things, and the former commissioner came in, she's sitting at my desk, and she turns around for a second, looks at the whiteboard, it's like secret projects. I was like, well, okay, I'll tell you about the first one. It's way earlier than we wanted to. Totally agree with what both of you have said. I think I'll add to that. Go get yourself a legislative mandate, because nothing funds a program better than a mandate from City Council. The most recent example I can give of that is last summer, a whole suite of legislative items came before Council that were related to our agency, one of which was creating a brand new sort of overlay license for those companies which do the largest number of trips in the city per day, 10,000 or more trips per day. This is Uber, Lyft, Via, and Juno. With that new license overlay came a whole suite of data reporting requirements, which were particularly in the legislation, which helped. It's not always great when council's telling you exactly what you want. You do want more flexibility, but it was helpful in being able to say we need the resources to be able to collect this data, store this data, analyze this data. We've got this mandate from council, and we've got to show results quickly.
So one thing I kind of want to talk about is whether you're working with other agencies or you're working with outside vendors, what sort of putting protections in place to ensure, one, de-identification, but two, when you put certain data sets together, creates a very clear picture of who is doing what where, and people do not always appreciate government tracking who is doing what where. So talk a little bit about how you all weigh the privacy arguments or the conversations around tracking and the rich data sets that are now quite easily collectible, whether through the private sector sources or through agencies. And some of this is obviously cutting through regulatory thicket to put together, but there's also some real kind of questions about, not just can we, but should we be putting data sets together. I know you all collect a lot of interesting data that you may need to kind of widen out. Do you want to kick this off?
Sure. Yeah, I think many years ago we had an unfortunate incident where taxi data that we had released publicly, where we had hashed the driver and vehicle license IDs, was re-identified. Basically, if you've got enough computing power, enough time on your hands, you can crack any of those, but it was like an unsalted hash scheme, so it could have been better, so that was lesson learned. Fortunately, it wasn't super sensitive data, but I think we really looked inward when that happened and thought about, okay, first, should we release these identifiers? And the issue with those in particular is if you have a driver identifier, you know their name because that's public information, but you can sort of tally up all their fares and know their personal income and also their travel behavior. So we definitely looked inward. We actually assembled a committee of data scientists, privacy lawyers, people that deal with health data, which has much more stringent requirements, to really think about what we were releasing publicly and what we should release publicly. The data scientists were there to say, this isn't enough detail for us to learn anything for this to be useful. The lawyers were there to say, this is what the law says, and privacy experts were there to sort of bring us to the worst case scenario, right? If we layer this data set with that data set, then this is what we're going to come out with. Out of those conversations, we've done things like, instead of reporting the exact pickup and drop-off location in our public data set, we roll that up to a neighborhood level. As we collect more data, we just started collecting a bunch more data in February. We'll be reconvening a group like that to think through those similar issues. I think another sort of direction we've gone is to try to report as much as we can in aggregate. So think about what things people are interested in and report those out as monthly indicators of the industries that we regulate. So expanding that over time to meet people's interest. And also, not everyone has the chops to analyze billions of records, so that sort of everyday New Yorkers can get a look into, what their government is doing.
Right. Lee?
Yeah, so I completely agree with everything that you said. I think the only thing I would add, or another way that I think about this, I think for both government and the private sector, we can kind of talk about privacy and all this data that's out there that's collected, by our cell phone companies. There's a lot of data collected by a lot of parties, and I think that for better or for worse, we're not really moving backward from that. So the next step, in addition to continuing to consider privacy, is thinking about how do we inform people about what's being collected. I think meaningful consent is really the framework that a lot of this is moving toward, both for government employees who are driving vehicles and suddenly they're sort of, it's like, oh, this knows where I'm going, what I'm doing, and et cetera. That's something that my shop has been working a lot with in parks. But also, if we're using data that comes from, like cell phone data, anything like that, thinking about how do we make sure that people understand that this data is out there, right? I think there's a lot of people who really don't even know what data is being sort of collected by us, by, third parties. I think that maybe framing it in terms of this is the data that exists. Unfortunately, for better or for worse, we're not moving back from that. This is how, we're going to sort of meaningfully make sure that everyone understands that.
Yeah. I'm just, and I want to get to Tayyab on this too, and then get some questions from the audience, but I'm fascinated. I was talking with a satellite company a while back that you cross-references with satellite data and can tell kind of comings and goings and get down to granular levels about individual and area, everything from diversity, wealth, and all sorts of interesting things, and work with government on it or provide that information for government. You obviously have some strict, working in health, human services, strict regulatory regimes that you have to finagle through. How much, and those keep us safe as well, but federal, state, local, some of them conflicting probably too, but how do you keep kind of both top of mind that mission area of how what the regulatory structure is for and kind of make decisions internally about how to use that data.
Yeah, I think, so internally, we've built a practice where privacy is first and foremost. And this is with the team, my internal team, and then it extends. We work very closely with the Mayor's Office of Information Privacy. And as of late, when we talk, like, with my team, we've sort of come to the motto that we build technical solutions in service of privacy, i.e. privacy is a technical requirement, and as much a requirement as security is. And so, you'll get lots of vendors that say privacy, stuff like this, but literally in New York City, the sort of array of different both legal and regulatory kind of constraints that you deal with put us in sort of what I call like a constant LSAT logic game, so to say. Like, we want to get to a good outcome, but how do you get to point B if A is B and C? And so you're constantly juggling around. And I think we've been very successful at leveraging technologies that exist that are in the city without having to buy anything. And when you put privacy first, you can come up with kind of new ways of using your technology to do that. One last point I'll put to this and say that when you get to should we, I think the kind of dimension that we are getting in, and I think the conversation where it's extending for the city as well, is not just a matter of data privacy, but data ethics. And so sure, we may be the team that is concerned with utilizing this type of data in service of integrated service and coordinated service, social service delivery, benefits access and expanding economic opportunity. But what happens to the team that succeeds mine, that inherits this platform? That may be under a different mandate, and one that is contra to ours. So even building platforms, this is, and I kid you not, we're a little bit weird when we go out to like talk to our agency partners. One of our kind of like current requirements for 2019 is how do we hide the data from ourselves? There are ways to kind of use data without actually having to disclose it or whatnot. And so thinking about kind of putting these restrictions, and if you can start first internal team, then I think that just promulgates to, as you move data to more public and more external forums as well. So starts here, and we kind of work in.
All right, let's take some questions from the audience here. Any questions? Got one in the back there. And I think the team up here is realizing that the big clock is because of me. But we'll go a couple minutes over, and I'll get some eye rolls, but that's okay. Go ahead.
So this was a really great discussion, and I sort of have a question that's going back to asking for the money. I'm going to assume that also means resources, right? So when you're going to scale up or out, you need people. And your story and how you got into these positions are really interesting. So what would you recommend as skill sets as we're trying to hire and build sort of like these data analytic groups, whether within the organization or as its own entity?
Great question. Anybody?
I'll start, I think. Yeah, so I think what I tell people is I always look for people who can learn how to learn. I think that a lot of these things, it's a skill set, it's not like impossible to learn. There's also more to it than just knowing how to write code. It's knowing how to write efficient code. It's knowing how to make code modular. It's knowing how to get things to, which language you should pick, et cetera. I think looking for people who are curious and also having the expectation that curious people who can learn how to learn will maybe have a limited stint in your office, and that's okay. Being comfortable with people passing through and sort of framing the work that way is an important part of that as well.
I'm going to say two things in relation to that, because I completely agree. Data engineers, data analysts, data analytics, obvious. But the really key thing here that gets underplayed a lot of times is both people who know how to ask questions and know how to ask the right question. And are also, I would say, maybe not obsessed, but really concerned about what they don't know. Because it's what you don't know, it's what someone is not saying about their data, it's what you're not asking that's always the thing that's going to trip you up. And so people that can do that, and one last kind of shout out is folks who have a discipline for documentation. Documentation is not the sexiest part of sort of the data story, However, all of our legacy systems have been around for years, are rife with a number of issues, and as new people get to look at it, the less documented, we have to get past sort of a culture of undocumented kind of source systems.
And Rodney, anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what both of you said, and I'll just add, as with any other job, just looking for people who just have a passion. And that, you know, in my agency, I'm not necessarily looking for someone with a passion in transportation, which is our realm, but just, you know, that they want to come to work and as you said, learn on the job and are curious and ask questions.
Civil service spirit there. Any other questions? Some up here. Up front.
We have time for one question.
Yeah. She's coming with the mic, because not that you don't have a loud enough voice, but we have video of this for folks on live stream.
With new tools and dealing with unstructured data, has that reduced any of the burden on data collection and data cleaning?
Has it reduced the burden?
Yeah, there's a lot of effort traditionally has been spent on data collection and getting in a format to analyze, but now we have text analytics, image analysis, and things like that. Has that reduced some of the burden on data collection and focus?
Not for me.
Yeah, I'd say no.
No, I mean, a lot of it too is, I think government is not always the first to get those tools. So, and certainly not any branch of government that I have worked in. So I think will it eventually? Yeah, but I think like any other data collection tools, those are only effective if you, they're not magic, right? You have to kind of know what you're looking for. You have to say, this is what I'm looking for. These are the parameters of what I need. In my previous job, we worked with a lot of GPS data that was really useful until we realized that it wasn't, we had to like reverse geocode it. And then when we realized we had to reverse geocode, we realized that we had a lot of issues with the way that the data was collected that we really hadn't been able to foresee with sort of procuring that tool. So I think the challenges are probably different, but I just say for me, I haven't felt the benefits reach yet. Maybe
Yeah, I'd say one of the things for us as a regulatory agency, when we put in a rule or regulation and then we look to data to enforce that rule, I think we have to be really careful about just how the data is collected, how exactly it's collected, at what precision, because we do have to take that, basically to court and say, they broke our rules.
Yeah, I would just say that I think we're still trying to conquer the structured data.
Right. Yeah.
And that in and of itself is, a challenge. And I don't, believe, like my colleague says, I don't believe that they're magic solutions. Even when these things, they may be able to cultivate, they may be able to pull stuff, but it doesn't necessarily mean they turn it into insights without understanding the context in which that data is collected or what it's for, or all the kind of inherent issues that may be rife within it.
Yeah. Well, before I get pulled off by my ear, let's thank the panel, and we'll go to stick around for the rest of our conversation. So thank you guys so much.